I just want to make the world safer. I was a mom. I'm very idealistic. I don't want to be a victim. I don't want anybody I know to be a victim. And I thought there's so much information we're not using.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Collators. Today we have Deborah Osborne, intelligence analysis educator and former intelligence analyst. Her early career started in the Buffalo Police Department, but she later joined the US Secret Service, but she's had a number of educator and trainer roles throughout her career. We'll hear about that in a second. But she's also authored books on intelligence analysis. But I'm going to let her tell a little bit more about her story. So, hello, Debbie.
Hello, Mark, and hello, Howard. Real pleasure to be here. Was thinking that it would be helpful if I just tell about prior to becoming an analyst, because I didn't become an analyst till the week I turned 41. So I had a life, but I will make it short. I was like a very introverted child. I cried. I didn't want to go to kindergarten. I cried at my first part-time job interview. I had 4 children by the time I was 25 and no dreams of a career. I got to read whatever books I wanted. I was a voracious reader, was quite interested, though, at an early age about thinking because my mother had a serious mental illness. And in our house, there were many books about thinking and about being psychologically healthy. And there were spiritual books, there were philosophical books. So I, of course, just like you read a cereal box, I was reading everything I could. And I also wanted to have a really good brain because I never wanted to be unhealthy, right? So that was my goal. And so I knew I was intelligent. I did well in school, and I knew I wanted to get a degree because I didn't want to be a waitress forever, as were my part-time jobs in my 20s. So at the end of my 20s, I went to a state university of New York that allowed for independent study for adults who were either working or like me, I had children, I had a part-time job. And I met one-to-one with my professors, which was really great because I had no confidence. I don't still know how to pronounce words because I only was speaking to children, for my whole 20s. So my whole 30s, 30 years of my life, I was very sheltered. And I got a degree in psychology. I thought maybe I would be a therapist, but then I realized that wouldn't be so good for me because I didn't want to work. I had a mother who had struggles, and I wanted to do something different, but I didn't have real work experience. So I took jobs in the field of developmental disabilities in my 30s. I also worked short time for the IRS in between 2 of those jobs. And the job as a behavior specialist working with people with developmental disabilities involved going out in 4 counties in all different settings. I had a lot of confidence based on that, but also it was very structured on what I was supposed to do. And so there was a plan with a behavior, and so a crime is a behavior, right? I knew what I was supposed to do. I would assess the behavior. I would look at all the records. I would interview people. I would develop a plan. I would monitor it and see if there was success. And then my sister showed me an announcement for the civil service job of crime analyst for the city of Buffalo. And I thought, it was so cool, because I could use my brain power for something that might be a little easier than trying to change the behavior of developmentally disabled people, which is really challenging and not a lot of success. So being kind of a magical thinker and not too afraid to try new things, I took the test and I scored very high, which was great because I had no political connections, and was hired as a crime analyst. And the reason they were looking for a crime analyst is they were getting a new records management system at the Buffalo Police Department. And their commissioner at the time was Gil Kurlikowski. He came from Seattle and he was more progressive. And later he became the drug czar of the United States. They also, at that time in 1997, crime mapping was a big thing. And the University of Buffalo had a strong GIS department. So I started out with no direction at all. Just, we're going to wait till the new RMS comes. You just sit here, you'll go to training. So I'm like, no, this is scary. What am I going to do? So I started learning, and from going to training from the listserv LE analyst, I got as much help as I could, asking, What would you do if you were in a city that had 1,000 police officers, 20,000 Part 1 crimes, which are the more serious crimes, probably 40,000 crimes a year, and how would you start out? And so I got ideas, and I eventually produced like a weekly, biweekly newsletter, crime bulletin. It was very easy to find serial crime patterns when you have so much crime. You're looking at all the robberies, you're looking at all the burglaries. Auto thefts wasn't as easy because the officers didn't put a lot in their forms. But I wondered, how could there be a job where no one knows? There's no books. Even before I started, I looked all over. I couldn't find anything. And I thought, wait a minute, there's more books on frogs and toads and birds. What's a crime pattern? It's not identified. And that really, really bothered me. So I was also really fortunate because I live near Canada. I'm probably 10 minutes away right now from Canada. I could go up where there's analysts, like real humans. There's always this feeling like, here's this world. No one knows what I should do, but other people in the world know what I should do. And it's real. I'm not making it up. And I worked there 10 years. But the difficulty was, even when I did a good job, no one really understood why I needed more people. It was just, they just didn't know. And now in New York State, there's all these crime analysis centers. There's like at least 20 people in the county. The city has the most crime. There's doing the analytical work, and it's just way different. But I also lived near Erie, Pennsylvania, where Bob Heibel, had research and intelligence analyst program. And he and I became friends. He sent a few interns to me. I always had interns, but I got to know him. I went to at least 2 colloquiums. I met Mark Evans from the Police Service of Northern Ireland. I helped him bring analysts to North America. I met Russell Swenson, who was the editor for the National Defense Intelligence College's books, and I got to write a book for them, but I didn't get paid. I taught college online. I finished my master's degree that I had started before I joined the police department, and I quit doing it because it was in policy studies. And I just couldn't understand policy studies. But once I worked in law enforcement, I realized policies don't have to make sense. And because I couldn't understand why all these things weren't working. And then I changed it to criminal justice policy, and I finished my master's degree so that eventually maybe I could teach online. Because really, to be honest, I like to not be working in a regular office, and I don't like anybody overseeing me. I think because I was free for 30 years, every job feels like being captured and put in a pigeonhole. But I have to say the police department allowed me to do whatever I wanted. And some people, just like, as you know, in any agency, they were so nice and helpful to me. And some people were not. They were mean to me. They were, just not supportive. And one thing I did too is I heard that some analysts had data dictionaries, and I know you gentlemen are IT familiar and science familiar. And I thought, wow, I didn't have one. I don't even know what's in the database. University of Buffalo had an ontology conference. So I went to that just to think about what could we know here? And so I was really interested always more in what is this profession? I have listened to some of your podcasts. I joined both IALEA and ISDA. I was more working for local level police as a tactical analyst, and later at the Secret Service as an investigative analyst. So I was more interested in that than anything, even though I did everything at the Buffalo Police Department. I liked being tactical. I liked being investigative. But why isn't there any language for what we do? There's academics. I networked with many academics. I know Kim Rossmo. I know Jerry Radcliffe. I know lots of famous, quote unquote, people, but academics always have their academic agenda, their theory. And I just want to make the world safer. I was a mom. I'm very idealistic. I don't want to be a victim. I don't want anybody I know to be a victim. And I thought there's so much information we're not using. Data, information, whatever you want to, both really. And it just irritated me so much. So I quit my job after 10 years and was teaching online and trying to write a novel about analysts so I could educate the world, which I did write the novel, but not try to get it published. And then I, through serendipity, got hired by the Secret Service in my 50s and worked there for 8 years till I retired. And I was able to work on major investigations and see the other side of the house, which I think I was better at, but I didn't feel as urgent to do it because you're prosecuting a huge crime pattern of what are these people doing, like a big credit card skimming ring or something. But I wanted to stop like the purse snatcher, the serial rapist, the burglar, but it was stressful, right? So it was much easier to work on a long investigation. And I think I was better at it because, well, of course, the focus is there, right? You know what you're looking at. You're trying to gather. I'm very good at simplifying things because I wrote poetry since I was 11. And what do? You take major concept and you boil it down to a few words. I loved making charts. I used to make them for my developmentally disabled clients who couldn't read. What is your goal? And now I could make a chart for investigators or for my own purposes. I really love doing that. So I think, and then writing the books. So maybe we could talk about writing the books because I have 2 books that you each have one of my books, which is really fun to see. But
well, we said off air before we recorded, I think it's important to mention that all of your books are definitely worth picking up. I particularly liked the introduction to crime analysis because when you were telling us your story about how you got into the role, you had a very rich life prior to joining law enforcement. And I think it's hard to describe to people who haven't made the jump from like civilian life into police life. It's a huge culture shock, right? It's just kind of like, and I don't just mean analysis at this point. I just mean becoming a civilian and going into the police force is such a shock that takes some adjustment. But then when you go into a police intel role, as you alluded to, and it's been a similar experience for me and for Howard, is that a lot of this stuff wasn't written down, or if it was written down, it was kind of sometimes quite hard to access. I mean, this is all pre-internet. This is all, we couldn't Google stuff, right? This was literally, you did library searches and catalog searches, and maybe you found something, maybe you didn't. But yeah, so I'd recommend everybody pick up the books, and we'll go into that. But one of the things that I quite liked about your book, and I hope you don't mind me just going to read one particular thing that jumped. Well, so I like lots of things in this book, but I really like this bit. So this is the 10 commandments of crime analysis. And I really liked the commandment number 9, which is, in the end, your boss is not your direct supervisor, nor is it your bureau head, nor is it your commissioner or chief. You ultimately work for the people who live, work, and play in your jurisdiction. And your job, like the job of any police department as a whole, is to make life safer. And I really liked that because I thought, I was trying to think of a time where I've read in an intelligence book where the public duties kind of explicitly kind of talked about. I mean, Howard, I don't know if you've got any other experiences of where that's been explicitly kind of mentioned, but I was struggling to think of another time when I've actually seen that leap from a page, because I think it's an important thing, right? And sometimes we don't talk about it enough in intelligence analysis, which is we all just assume that we're objective truth seekers, that there's no careerists out there that are trying to get ahead. But yeah, I just wanted to point that out, that I thought it was do you remember writing that? Was there a reason behind it?
I really love that you picked that out, because I am also thinking, because my latest book, Howard has the first edition, but the second edition is coming out. And like why I used AI and I don't feel bad is for the public good, right? It's like I can't write something that will help people as well as I could without collaborating and using this tool. So for me, because I've been retired since 2018. And for me, it's like, I don't really even want to be thinking about this. But the reason I think about it is because if I could, I'm propelled to help for that reason. That's the only reason. I don't even like attention. It would be hard to believe, but I'm here. But I really don't. I am just like that child who read a lot of books and people say, Debbie, go out and play. I like to think, which is why I like your podcast too. But I like to create, but to serve. I'm more of a servant, right? Which sounds silly because you don't hear that in this profession.
Sure. But if you don't mind going into a bit more detail, was there a tension there when you were serving in Buffalo or maybe Secret Service where maybe...
Definitely. Because, the good thing about being me is I don't actually really care what you think about me because it's not me. It's the job. If I was thinking you were judging me, I wanted the job, and even all my efforts to be an advocate for the profession are about this job matters for society. So when I'm there, even though, of course, it hurt, it was very difficult, to go to a a district. We had 5 districts, and try to say, what can I do for you as an analyst, and have people snickering in the back and making fun of me. And also, I think what helped is I was older. And so I was on the floor with the command staff, which was also bad, but also people were more open to respecting me because I was in my 40s than if I was 20. So there was some advantage to being older. But, and I'm also used to being considered like an outlier, an unusual person. So to be the analyst, but even at the Secret Service, I was the first analyst in that field office. Some people knew what to do with me. Some people didn't. Some people came to me. Some people didn't. Some people thought they didn't care, they weren't as friendly as other, it was just that. And I don't like it. I didn't like it, but I could endure it. That was the issue too. Like, should it be a civilian analyst? Should there be sworn analysts? And that's the other issue. Can a civilian know what police do? And maybe Howard could say something about that.
Yeah, I'm biased. Being an old fart, now retired, even from my second career in academia, where I was training law enforcement and civilians. A couple of things stood out, Debbie. Firstly, just to the point about your commandment, which I completely agree with. One of the issues I've always had is in educating people or dealing with people, there's a hierarchy of needs. It's known in training as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the basic ones are the things you need to survive: food, heat, clothing, that kind of thing, a roof over your head. But as it goes up at the very top of the things that you need, through the part where in your social interactions you need to be liked, the top are the values. What makes you as a human being? What would you stand up and fight for? And that kind of has an echo in law enforcement and the military, I guess, and emergency services, the health service. This idea that you're trying to help other people or help a higher cause than just little old you. When I joined the police in the UK, just to speak back to that commandment, in the UK, when you join a police force, it's a local force. You're paid regionally by the local taxpayers to a national pay grade, and you're employed locally, but to legal standards and policies that by and large are national. They are created by society for a societal good through our politicians. Okay, it ain't perfect, but that's the idea, and I have to go along with that. But my warrant card would say I'm employed by the force, but people would say to me when I'd pulled somebody up when I was a young law enforcement officer, you stop somebody for speeding. Why are you stopping me for speeding? I pay your wages. I employ you. I said, yes, you do, but I don't work for you. I've had it with senior officers. You work for me. No, you are my supervisor. You are not necessarily my superior in knowledge, ethics, or anything like that, but you're not my superior. Well, who do you work for? Do you work, you work for the government? No, I work for the law. Every UK police officer, in truth, is actually an independent actor, an outlier of society that's there to enforce the law. So regardless of my politics, my personal views, my cultural or social alliances or loyalties or who puts food on the table, my aspiration is to a higher thing. It's kind of like the Hippocratic Oath for the medical profession, for those of them who still remember it somewhere back in beyond, because life makes jaded people of us all. It beats us down, I suppose, in a way. So your link back to that, I think, really matters for analysts, because another thing that I pick up on, and I love this background for you in terms of your approach through psychology, it gives a different perspective. I think all of us, and I wasn't an analyst, I started in law enforcement. I was a scientist before that as a graduate. But I came to analysis as a tool that helped me do my job as a law enforcement officer better, as an investigator. And then I realized over the years, learning about the profession as I did, because I think we're all on a journey of learning to the day we die, not just professionally, but personally. I came to the realization that analysis and information processing is what makes us intelligent beings versus non-intelligent beings, if you will, or beings with less data processing facilities. And I think the analysts amongst us, we're actually all introverts. Like we are the oddballs, and they make the best analysts because we feel outside of society or some group. We are able to look at things from an outsider's perspective. And I really think that helps us, this is just my personal view, take off the blinkers sometimes and approach problems from a different point of view, or data sets, and maybe see things, who was it, Schopenhauer, the person who not just sees what everybody sees, but actually thinks what nobody else thinks. That's an analyst. It may not be a valuable perspective or a productive one, but it's useful to consider it as a possibility or as an option. Then at least your analysis or your interpretation of any data or any information is a rounded one. There are an infinite number of theories that might explain a particular data set. Who's to say yours is right? But the more that you consider as a group, the more you're likely to come up with the right answer by discounting the ones that can be disproven or less likely or less practical. Or in crime, less relevant. With crime, it's not just the potential to commit crime or even the intent, but do people have capability? And this is one of the things that Carmen would always aspire to, and I agree with her completely. When you're assessing the potential for crime, you've got to assess not just the propensity, but their capability to commit. If Britain or some minor nation had a political situation or perspective on life that could affect the global cult that would really upset things globally, it's hardly likely to, because we're not a big important nation anymore. But the larger powers, the USA, China, Russia, these people who are on the world stage, if they get into that situation, it's a problem for the world. If we get into that situation, it's just an inconvenience from an old friend. It's like you put grandfather back in the box and pat him down and leave him with his daytime TV and whatever, where the others you have to sit and take notice. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, and I know Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and for me too, it's not just the law. So you're an officer. Trying to understand why we don't have things in writing is making me work with AI, with LLMs to figure out what's going on here. But just the idea of, like, we take a police report to show a law was broken, but we don't take the information we might need to solve the crime. And so for me, it's safety and protection. Like, I want you, Howard, when you were a street officer, to protect me. I don't care if you arrest someone. I want you to protect me from harm. So it's harm reduction. It's also using our brains as deeply as we could to address that. Yes, Mark?
Sorry, I think this is linked to what you've both said. I think Schopenhauer, your point about why isn't a lot of this written down? Why is it so difficult to define? I was just trying to flick through the book. I thought I had a second bookmark there, but you wrote about, I think you phrased it as that sometimes it's a constant war for analysts to basically persuade internally their value and their beliefs. Mm-hmm. And that's quite a strange, because think about this, right? So as I read that, I'm thinking, you worked in Buffalo and I worked literally across the Atlantic. And we've had this conversation with other colleagues in other countries, in other, not just law enforcement. And there is this pressure to prove your worth, to define that you are real, that almost like you've got to work harder than any other support function. Because if you think about, I don't know, underwater search or a mounted horse section or armed off, or whatever the specialist function might be, I don't think many of those specialist functions have the existential anxiety to say, well, obviously you need an underwater search unit, or obviously you need detectives, or other. It's a strange facet that seems to, and I think one of the reasons is I think you, Howard, and I have grown up reading intelligence analysis literature, in your case, more broader psychological literature. We talk a lot about information work and knowledge workers, information workers. I think actually we are belief workers. I think, and this is probably where your experience in prior to your police career paid off, I think big, is that I think we're in the business of formation of belief, and there's nothing harder than to persuade somebody from an already held belief. And I think that's why we're in the firing line all the time, because it's our job a lot of the time to pass lots and lots of material, come to an understanding of a situation or some set of circumstances. We then have a belief, and then we have to try and communicate that belief. And I'm guessing you've had some pretty hard times, both in Buffalo and in the Secret Service, where you've had to go to extreme lengths to convey that belief and to get that across the line. Is that fair?
I wouldn't say so much in an investigation, because we would be more on the same page. It was defined. But that was one of my shocks and stresses in life too, because, personally, I didn't want a job where no one knew what I was supposed to be doing and I'm going to have to say I'm valuable. And even when I became valuable, no one knew why. I mean, they couldn't define why. And so I was interested on the meta scale, like how could there even be a profession, which is why I tried to write a novel. And I'm going to work with that with AI. I am working with that to make novels to say this is real. And I don't even know if there's any profession like that has to defend itself and prove that even though they use analysts, they still don't understand. And when I was, I've been posting on LinkedIn and I was trying to solve the problem using AI about, well, how, the definitions of analysts, like the intelligence analyst role, more in the US, you call us all intelligence analysts, and the crime analyst role. And then I got 18 roles of an analyst and they were distinct. There were a few overlapping. But if we had a profession where someone knew what you were supposed to do, because people think you can do anything. I used to hate when people would say, she's the stats person at the police department. And then a lot of people would say, just work your magic. Like no one knows even if you tell them what you have, the tools you have, it's like foreign. And so it's a really strange thing, Mark, and you're so true. And that is why I would not even be bothering trying to write the book I just wrote, rewrite the book I just wrote, because I see it still going on. I started it in 1997. And I think one of the reasons that it's like this, though, is that we didn't have the technology to do the kinds of things we can do now. And it could be internal, like Howard would know in the beginning. You can have a desk and you could only do so much anyway. Now, analysts are tasked with everything, analyzing cell phone records, video things. And if we don't define what the different roles, the disappointment in an analyst is going to grow and grow because people have different expectations, undefined maybe in their head, but they hire you and then you're not able to do it because you're not that kind of person. You can't do everything well.
Debbie, that's a really important point, because as much as we as individuals would be or active or former analysts, so we're on a journey of discovery and learning, the profession, or not so much the profession, the world that we're trying to interpret, the tools that we use to interpret them and the data that's fed to those tools is changing so quickly that the job then is changing so quickly. So as fast as we're going and trying to say, yeah, I've got a handle on it, maybe this will help think. Automatically, people saying, yeah, but actually, if you look at the practitioners, they're now here or here or here. We're playing a catch-up game that, unfortunately, I think technology, politics, and interconnectivity, if you want to put it with that title, with global data, global organizations, global law enforcement and crime, it's so much better resourced to advance and change than we are, particularly when you're trying to capture and distill knowledge and understanding and check your understanding before you write something down, rather than it being just a throwaway comment on some kind of social podcast or posting, shall we say. I think we're always going to struggle against that. Plus, as analysts, do you not think we're always looking for kind of, as Mark would call it, the secret sauce, some kind of understanding of what makes us special? And whilst we're busy looking for that, somebody's taking the normal sauce off the shelf in the supermarket that doesn't really cover have any secrets, and they're using that because practically it works, and then they move on. We have a quality standard that we set ourselves that maybe life doesn't need. We've talked about that in some kind of analytical solutions, where in law enforcement you tend to go for beyond a reasonable doubt. You have some kind of risk profile of, am I right or not? Could I be wrong before you take operational action? And if I'm wrong, what are the consequences? Will people, and it's the same in health or many professions, will people die, or will they just not get a better quality beef burger next week? Is it a so what phenomenon? So that aspiration to ethical and intellectual and moral standards maybe gets in the way of us keeping pace. I don't know.
Well, can I say something? Because with the technology too, I think people confuse the role of people who are good at using technology as being an analyst. And I think that's where the thinking goes. And maybe analysts are more like nurses, and I don't know who would be the doctor, but there doesn't seem, but it's still a specialty that needs certain kind of thinking depending on your role, right? But some of the analysts are just technology people.
I completely agree. That's the most important thing that I've heard anybody say for an awful long time. We have tools, and those tools can be great. They don't think for us. Even AI doesn't think for us. But certainly the data visualization tools that we are sold, I've known people who are geniuses at working with that stuff, and all power to them. It's a tool. You are merely representing information and data in a way that somebody is going to have to try and think and interpret. I'm not saying that's not important. It's not the end product. One of the things I love about psychology as a profession is, regardless of the tools we throw at it, it's people who are skilled at thinking about how people think. And they're always working on improving their own thinking skills. Ultimately, for me, that's what an analyst is. They might do data analysis, they might do data representation, they might do product delivery in terms of providing intelligence assessments and products, but ultimately, we're paying them to think. And the problem is, like you say, thinking's invisible. If you walked into a room of people thinking, most senior officers would look around, or senior people would look around and say, they're all sat doing nothing. You can't see a mental process where you can with a bricklayer or somebody drawing. And for me, that's important. The other problem, I think, because we're always fighting for our credibility, is most people, everybody on the planet thinks it's part of your biological function, like your heart beating and your lungs working. But not all people think as well as others. They're limited in the way that they do it, like not all people physically are as capable as others. I wear spectacles, so my eyes are not as good as other people's. That's just a biological limitation or an age limitation. But most people would say, why do I need somebody to think for me? And just because you're in a position of power doesn't mean that you're a better thinker. However you've climbed the pyramid of life to get to where you are, it's not always because you're a better thinker. And we can all think of many senior organizational leaders or line managers or politicians that you think they're just nuts. They might be powerful and important and have skills in other ways, and all credit to them, but their thought processes are extremely limited. And we, as analysts, Mark and I have discussed this a lot, we often have to do the thinking for them. How do I politically, having come up with an analytical product, present this in a way that these recipients of my product will react to it in the right way, rather than going off on the wrong tangent or dismissing it as irrelevant when actually it's really important. And again, that's something that Carmen and others have picked up on. So I think your start profession, pre-law enforcement, is actually perhaps the best grounding for coming into the world of analysis, and ultimately put the machines and AI to one side. People need to understand how they think and how they can make mistakes when they're thinking.
Not just like the metacognition, the being aware of one is thinking, and that even when you think of AI, there's a lot of criticism about and fear about the future. It is just showing it. We are the product. We're the product of our culture, our education, all our experiences. Our thinking isn't even ours in a way. We think that we're unique and special, and we are. I mean, here we are, but we are on some level, but on another level, on just like, how are you going to say, where did you get your thoughts from? And if you're using AI, but instead you just read books and you're remembering it, you didn't originate your thoughts. You are the product of your whole lifetime in ways. But I'm also thinking of the kind of thinking we don't use and I talk about it in my new book, is diagnosing crime problems. So I'm also looking at it like a medical thing or psychiatric problems. They have a big book called the DSM. I don't know what number it is now, 6 or something, 7, but it's a diagnostic statistical manual, and it'll say all the symptoms. And so how do we look at things and make diagnose? We don't even know. It's just you and me out in the field because we're interested and we have certain talents. We have a certain kind of brain, like Howard is suggesting. Some people are good at this, some people are good at that. I just would really hate for the people who are good at building dashboards for law enforcement agencies to be called analysts if they're not interpreting it.
I agree with you completely.
All I'd add is, It's interesting you brought up the kind of the mental health comparison. In the UK, we have the Mental Health Act, which is a piece of legislation that covers essentially the rights of the individual who may be detained by the state and under mental health circumstances. There is actually a role within that for something called a second opinion appointed doctor, a situation whereby a patient can basically ask for somebody who's not involved directly in the process to kind of say, is this treatment the right one? So we said earlier about, I'm not sure how many other kind of professions have like a similar thing. I think this all comes back to what role does the analyst play? Because you're on a journey and a quest to try and define what the job is, right? What it is in hard, concrete terms. To be completely honest with you, I'm not sure we'll get there. I hope you do. I hope I'm wrong. But I think it's because it's such a vast... When I ask myself, what have I been asked to do in my various roles that dovetails with Howard and yourself and everyone else we spoke to? I would say it comes down to one of four things. You're either a complexity expert, as is somebody with a high tolerance for boredom who can read a lot and go through a lot and open every drawer and filing cabinet. And you can not only chew all that, but you can actually process it and come up with something. Then you might be a technical expert, which is a different thing to complexity. You just might have technical skills to make very pretty charts and nice things to look at and or access systems. Your book talks a lot about record. I love another thing I like about your book is how you almost said there's like plenty of cautionary tales about not over trusting the record system. I feel like you've got some stories there. You probably had some nightmare stories, but I think that's an overlooked piece. The third role, I think for me was, and this goes back to your public duty point and Howard's point about you are a servant of the law. I think there's a role as a devil's advocate truth seeker. As in this situation, to avoid groupthink and to avoid any sort of sense of perverse incentives to either please superiors or some sort of wider agenda, there's something to be said for the role of the truth champion. But the fourth and final one is probably just being the oddball who can come up with something really out of left field, right? Something that's so non-standard, something that's so out there. So, but here's my problem, right? So if we look at the AI, okay, can AI do complexity? I think you can do complexity pretty well at the moment, actually. And I think, yeah, okay, we need to keep down that. Can it do technical? Oh boy, yes. And give it 5-10 years? Oh boy, even more. Can it do devil's advocate champion of truth? That I'm not so persuaded of, because I think when you lived in Buffalo, and Howard, we are part of our communities, right? We live, there's all sorts of information coming to us. I think truth is a big word. And I think we kind of all have a fuzzy idea of what it means. And I'm not one of these people who goes, it is your truth and my truth and every kind of truth. There is the truth, right? I think there is an objective truth that we can maybe catch a glimpse at. And I think that's where analysts can shine. And the fourth one, the odd box, the cognitive diverse. Can we come up with something that's so out there, random, but has direct application in this situation? I don't think AI can do that. And I don't think AI will ever do that because I think, without going into too technical detail, I think it's so grounded in a statistical kind of revert to the mean average of everything written down that I don't think you're going to get the kind of weird stuff. Because sometimes the weird stuff comes because we watched a TV show last night or we remember something back from 5 years ago, right? It's the Leonard Cohen song, "The Crack is How the Light Gets In." You need some error, you need some randomness to generate that content. So I think there's definitely sorry, Howard, go for it.
I agree with you. And we have broadly the same ideas about LLM. I love AI LLM. It's the ego to Frankenstein. It's the servant that goes out, trawls a particular form of data and comes up with a summary for us very quickly and efficiently. It ain't thinking for us, and its data source is only what it can access. It doesn't have eyes, ears, senses. It doesn't have sensibilities for human interaction. It's how we told it. It may have humanistic characters because it was built by humans. It's like all tools are built for humans. We build hammers and picks and axes and things and rifle butts to be held in a hand because we are a creature with fingers. If we'd grown up with flippers, our toolbox would be very different. Mentally the same. One of the things that I was listening to the radio today by pure chance, and they were talking about bias. And I love bias as a feature of thinking. And they're making the point that we start learning, and Debbie's talked about this today. I've talked about it a lot. This idea that our senses and our brain processes, like Popper's worlds, we are sucking in data and forming opinions, whether we like it or not, passively, all day and every day, even before we're born. Sounds can penetrate the womb and feelings, pre-birth medical situations, in the mother can actually chemically interact with the child, and they're saying that might create certain biases. I don't know, I'm not a doctor, but it seems sensible to me. But then certainly after birth, we are automatically programming that human being that comes out that starts out as almost an empty data set, an empty memory block, and it starts filling itself from all the stuff it gets fed. And that means it's biased because it's the product of what that individual experiences. And mine's different to Debbie's, different to yours, Mark. It's even different. If I had a twin brother, which I don't, my twin brothers would be, the further we get away from birth, the more our mental perspectives would diversify. And that creates bias, conscious and unconscious. I don't have an issue with that. Nobody, but to be aware that we are flawed and our perspective is skewed is no bad thing as a general principle. And if an analyst understands that, or any operative, in the way that they approach the data, the problem, the people they're working with, the environment they're working in, that's a good starting point. But it also makes you what people have called me in the past, the troublesome priest. The person who speaks the uncomfortable truth that people need to hear. And I don't mean being impolite or waving banners and screaming and shouting. We don't work like that. We go through quiet persuasion and open ourselves up to criticism. That's what good peer review and professional review is all about. But you're going to speak that kind of truth not to power, but to the information and to the issue. And it's always going to be, my perspective is imperfect. It may be biased. It's certainly incomplete as a sample of the population of data that might give us a better handle on this. And that data really matters to me, because what I find is one of the unconscious biases that we have, conscious in some cases, is to the types of data and how we deal with them. Now, the program today was talking about unconscious and conscious bias in racism, whereby in the UK, this was talking, medical experts, they'd found through statistical analysis that medical professionals thought that white females, including Eastern European, had a lower threshold of pain to those of darker skin colour. And biologically, there was nothing to base that on. And it was still with mothers who were going through pregnancy and childbirth, that for some reason, white mothers needed more painkillers than non-white. And you think, what? Surely how there may be a biological reason, I'm not competent to comment, but that there was a bias there. They could find no biological reason that these medical professionals were using when they decided that woman A needed a certain level of painkiller at a certain threshold of pain, and woman B needed something different. And I wonder it made me think about us. We as analysts, we tend to get the normal staple diet of data set. It might be an intelligence report from another law enforcement professional agency, actor, whatever. It may be information from an external data set that's been collected. Some of them, think about banking data or financial transaction data or telecom traffic data. We tend, I suspect, a lot of analysts will trust those and have more confidence in those than they would in data that has some kind of unknown provenance. They would be biased towards relying on it more. I can't prove it. It's just my thought process. I would have to test it. But certainly, Mark, when we were dealing with serious and organised crime, and I can remember analysing data around phone calls without going into detail post 9/11 about the pre-9/11 preparation, working with some of my North American colleagues, as one does, and thinking at the time, well, we're relying on data sets here that are machine generated for another purpose. Telecoms traffic data. Nothing wrong with that, but who's to say that's any more reliable than human source information or some other data set like geocoding or other spatial data? And so I wonder how much of what we do as analysts actually involves us unconsciously giving more credit to some data than others. It's like, somebody produces a pinwheel chart or an event line or a link chart using one of these tools, and the icons there and the link lines, and you think, wow, look at that. That must be right. Well, I have proven time and time again, and this is no insult to those companies, the products and software are brilliant. It's not them. It's the users and their misuse of the product. And I've said, it doesn't mean that. It's nothing more than a representation of information. The meaning that you're giving to it has no, I'm not saying it's not correct. I'm saying it has no basis. In fact, you're making a leap. Well, it's on the pinwheel and this machine's brilliant. You see where I'm coming from? Which brings me full circle back to this idea of it's what we do in our ability to think outside the box and not taking what we're being spoon-fed that maybe other people without that perspective would say, yeah, this is okay, because we get it all the time. This idea of repetition of bad data or bad information, it becomes accepted in the psyche because we are these biological learning people.
And I think it goes into like more holistic thinking. If you're good at statistics, you look at the lens, you have your glasses. If you look at mapping, GIS, you look in locations, if you look at communications, and to be aware of that. Now, it might be that that's what you're good at, but you can't say that that's the whole
comfort zone.
The whole picture. But back to what Mark said, I think oddball would, to me, be the creative. And I think that was one thing I don't see in this profession. It's always, yes, it's so important. There's a risk in being creative because you're the oddball. What is, we could use like analysis of competing hypotheses. We could be very analytical and pick apart our thoughts, but that we end up, if we do that too much, we lose the other side of things. I think even though they say now there's not a left and right brain, I think I'm both, maybe more than most people. And I really care about my right brain. And so I wanted to bring that to work. And I'm not working, but I'm obviously taking the leap to be an oddball and write things and be on this podcast and do what I do.
That's really important, I think, because what's derivative about AI is obviously, and this is a very crude hyperbolic simplification, but essentially, is this the aggregate of everything that we've got currently written down? And it's almost an aggregate of the stuff that gets said the most. And just because it gets said the most doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing. I think, time for another rubbish analogy, but I think it kind of fits. I'm sure you've both heard of this idea of the Aztecs seeing the Spanish on the horizon, and this idea of that they had no concept of what these ships were. You can see the ships, right? I think they're described as floating mountains. This idea, you see these strange abstract shapes, and then there's no notion of what it could be. I think in some respects, analysts, and not just analysts, operational staff as well, we're in this uncertainty space, this frontier of uncertainty, where if the organizations that we served recognize the situations they were in instantly or easily, they don't need us, right? They don't need people to be in that uncertainty space. But when you are in that uncertainty space and you've got to try, you're the Aztec and you're looking at the shape, you're thinking, what is that? What could that mean? What are the implications of that? Well, we can look at all of our current knowledge. We can go to the record system, right? We can review everything. We can try and read all the books and read all of them. Okay. Any help there? We can maybe talk to everybody. You any ideas? No. So I think the creative part is super important because I think that ability to innovate and maybe bring abstract ideas into it is a way of going beyond the data sometimes. And you just might get to the conclusion that actually those are ships full of people and those people could mean trouble. And I think that's kind of where I see intelligent analysis going forward is, and I'm not settled on one. I've described it before as a pendulum. On some days, I think analysts are a thing, a distinct thing, and we should enshrine and protect the role of analyst. But there are other days where the pendulum swings the other way, and I think actually, if we got our technology right, if we move beyond keyboards and mice, and maybe the AI interaction gets a lot easier, and we get the kind of sci-fi kind of computer interaction. Maybe we just, you could bring more people into the operational space who just had similar skill sets and personalities and from a diverse cognitive, range of ideas. So, but I don't think we're there yet. So I think the role of analyst has definitely got a few decades left. But I do sometimes worry that by the demarcation, by saying, I'm an analyst, you're not an analyst, I sometimes worry that creates the risk that we go too far with that we bring up a wall and say, okay, I can see, I'm the wizard, I can see, but you can't see because you've not had my training. And I think that's because we are in that uncertainty space and we're in the business of helping others form beliefs. The higher the walls we build, the more likely people will forget us. And we'll go back to what you described in your book, that never ending war of trying to persuade people of our value.
Do you not think, though, Mark, that the way to do that is, rather than saying, I'm an analyst, you're not, say, this is analysis, and then have levels of analysis that are people learning to think in more developed levels, better and better and better. And it may be for some practical situations, you don't need what I would call today grade 1 analysis, the most high-level kind of abstract thinking for the problem you're dealing with. But that recognition, and then people, whether or not they're paid full-time analysts or not, in terms of their profession, can aspire to those or recognise that there's a scalar of it. I'm really pleased with something that Debbie said, and this idea of left brain, right brain. If we accept that we're all the products of our lives, one of the values of societies is about individual creatures working together for a common good, and one that's maybe higher than merely food, water, roof over your head, not dying when the next saber-toothed tiger comes round the corner, or your bigger, harder neighbour comes round and beats you to death with a rock or with whatever modern equivalents we have. And we've just had the most recent debacle in the events in Davos, which shows we're still at that level of primitive, the monkeys in 2001 and the monolith. And there are a lot of actors in those rooms. I'm not picking on one. But one of the things for me is we're all human. In law enforcement, I wore 2 hats. I was first and foremost a police officer, and then for most of my career a detective, an investigator of crime of all kinds, particularly later on in my service, the more serious and complex. That's what floated my boat. That's what I did my PhD in. But I also was an analyst. So I wore 2 hats. And yes, you can say jack of all trades, master of none. I don't think anybody's a master of their trade, whether an investigator or an analyst. I think we're all journeymen. But if somebody said to me when I ran a team of investigators looking at a complex crime problem, and I've done this myself training senior officers, senior investigators, if you're offered more assets, which every manager always wants, what would you want? If the job said, well, I'll give you more assets, and most of them would say, give me some more detectives. And I would say, no, give me somebody who thinks differently to all of us, because I've got a team of detectives already. If I've got 20 detectives on a series of homicides, 21 just means I can do the same thing more efficiently, but I'm going to be doing the same thing. But if I bring in an analyst or somebody from outside, it doesn't need to be an analyst with that professional title, somebody from outside our normal sphere of approach and perspective on life, the universe and everything, and on the job that we're doing, maybe they'll give me a different view that might be the key to changing my line of inquiry to get to some kind of success for what I'm trying to achieve, which is justice and what Debbie talks about, protect and serve the public, protect society from crime, even though that's not maybe their objective. And I've pulled people from the weirdest backgrounds. I've pulled in religious people. I've had to deal with people who thought they had second sight. Why should I worry about giving them a name? If they give me a different perspective as an investigator, I can consider that and machine it through the process. And if it takes me somewhere good, great. If it doesn't, at least I considered it. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is, I'm a human being. I am a product of life. I have my own values, my own ethics, and some of those, even with political and practical, pragmatic approaches to life where I need a job so I can't say what I really think sometimes because I need the money to bring up my family and survive and all the rest of it. I have my own values and views, and some of them are red lines, and they become more red lines the older and more certain I've got, or maybe that's just old age. But one of the things was, as a law enforcement officer, I'm sworn to uphold the law. And the law is there for things like murder, rape, other serious crime. There's a law for everything usually, and it's the same globally. Now, as a law enforcement officer, I would always follow the law. Yes, I've committed criminal offence. No, not criminal. I've committed offences. Several times I got done for speeding, and that's quite right and proper. No law enforcement or any official should be above the law that you practice. If anything, you should be more liable for punishment if you transgress, because you should know better. And I believe in that. But I have to say, as a parent and a grandparent, and as somebody in a relationship with another partner, if somebody had attacked them or attacked them now and hurt them, yes, if the law I felt in my assessment was likely to protect them, I'd follow the law. But if I didn't think it would, I wouldn't wait on the law. I would act to protect myself and my family, even if it meant breaking the law. And that, for me, who somebody spent all his career supporting law, is a hell of a thing. But it makes the point about humanity, which is kind of where I was getting from some of what Debbie said throughout. This idea that, yes, I'll follow processes, but I'm ultimately going to have as part of my assessment process, where are the values of humanity and good and the other benefits here, rather than the blinker of, I'm justified to do this because of the law. Lest we forget, during the Holocaust, the German people made laws that made it lawful to do what they did. It didn't make it right. It was obscene. So the law is nothing more than an artificial construct, kind of a baseline for good practice, but it doesn't take away people's humanity, nor should analysis, not good analysis.
And some reading I've done, in the scary world of what is AI going to do to change the world is it might make being human more valuable. And I just want to say, when Mark was talking about the Aztecs, I was thinking about, what if there was an Aztec who was watching, say, some insects, who there was some analogy to say they used a leaf and it was like a book, that they could imagine it. So I think imagination will become more important. What are we going to do with these tools? So yes, we're thinking it's going to spit back everything we need, and we're not going to have to do anything. But also, what other things could we collect? What things can we combine in new ways? How can we know more? So how do we know? And you talked about truth, Mark. And even though there is objective shared truth in our Western culture, if you were from another culture, that might not be true. So truth is depending on what your beliefs are, what your priorities are, what your beliefs are. Yet there are some universal truth. Like, that's why you see similarities in all different world religions. But I think we're in a very exciting time. And as far as I keep on thinking about, I used to think, well, there is no job for people who want to develop a profession that doesn't exist as a profession. So how does it get to be a profession? And I think we just would study other professions and think, like I did a post on, there's specialists, radiologists are different than surgeons. I really think we have a lot of specialist roles, but as AI gets rid of some of those roles or changes them, I think what we're going to have a higher level of thinking, because we won't need, just like people are saying, you're going to get rid of jobs, and you're going to have to also vet what comes out of the AI, right? Because look at some of the things that come out when I use LLMs is just ridiculous, and some is wonderfully in depth, but nobody's vetting. Someone has to vet it, because it won't be perfect. It will never be perfect.
Yeah, that's the thing. We at this stage, because of our experience of the world to this point in our lives, cumulatively, know to understand that handy and useful and a dopamine hit though LLMs can be, they are not a substitute. My worry is a bit down the line, the next generation and the generation after that, if they've grown up with those things. Like, I'm old enough, Mark will tell you, I've described how when I started in analysis, there was no IT. I used to go and draw link charts using wallpaper and child's toys and felt pens, and it took forever, particularly if you needed to modify something. And you talk about credibility, and I was a police officer, walking into a room of senior detectives, putting wallpaper around the room, and they're waiting for you to put the wallpaper up, and then asking them questions and drawing a chart from what they said. That really, it took a lot of courage. I wasn't bothered, but it takes a lot of courage to stand up and watch those people thinking, what the hell is this going on here? What worries me is in future generations, the people that follow us would be professionals. If they only have access to LLM type data, and they're only ever used to dealing with data sets that are based on a computer, because going outside and looking at things and talking to people simply isn't efficient. Look at us. We could not be talking face to face as a threesome live, but for these tools. So they're great for that. But we're also aware that you can go out and talk to people face to face, and you can engage with data sets and sucking in information in other ways. But we tend to spend most of our time on these machines. And I wonder how far down the line, as these data sets evolve, human beings will stop looking for other data sets and rely on these more for their understanding of thinking, not understanding of data. But you see where I'm coming from. So I'm worried we might generate another generation of data processors who are merely processing AI data rather than analytic thinkers who think individually and push the boundaries.
I agree, and I think I can link this to something Debbie's written that I'm going to ask her to kind of elaborate on. That one of the points in your book, and I agree with it on every level, says read every crime report. Don't just rely on the record manager. Read every report. Now, I agree with that in the strongest possible terms as a principle, but it does raise the problem of what if that's not possible? What if let's say you're in a police department, you can read 10,000 reports a month, but for whatever reason, the reports double. At that point, you have to rely on some sort of aggregate content. And that links to what Howard is talking about, because I see AI as kind of like easily accessible aggregate content. And so I can't read all the 10,000 reports, but maybe I can read the aggregate of those 10,000 reports. So Debbie, do you have a view as to, although I agree with you and it's in the book, what would you do if you couldn't read every crime report?
Well, and I couldn't read every crime report I read certain types of crime reports. So prioritize, right? And I think so many people don't read the crime reports. And, that is what bothers me. Not bothers me. I don't know that everyone will ever, but that even what's in the crime reports isn't collected enough to make it useful. I actually just did a Substack post. I made a new one called Crime Patterns on an animal behavioral study. He won a Nobel Prize studying geese and different animals, and it was about observation. But if you don't see the crime report, there's nuances in it. You don't know, the machine doesn't know of what you're going to miss. So I would always be looking at sex offenses with unknown assailant. They didn't know the person. Like I would look at robberies because they tend more to be serial. So I would read the crime reports, and it depends on your assignment, right? If you're in a big agency, maybe that's what you do. But also, I'm trying to think of an equivalent because, there's crime reports and then there's indicators for other types of crimes where there's no crime report. So you would research those things that might have value, but you read it because somewhere in your human brain, there'll be that spark that knows something. I like to read things about neuroscience. We still really don't know how we think. So there's even thoughts too, like our stomach's connected to our brain. So if the AI doesn't have a body ever, we're picking up things that we don't know though, right? Even though people want to reduce it, our reductionist way of studying things into the parts, it helps us understand things. That's how we have information. We have AI through neural networks and things, but it doesn't answer the question of being human and what that means and what we bring to the table. And I think, if anything, this discussion for me makes me very happy because it just emphasizes the importance of human values, human motivation, human application. So we're going to let AI rule our life. What do you need the information for will always be human, right? It's not going to be...
Mark and I have talked, I agree with you, and that's kind of a really nice positive point to end on if we were ending, but actually there's more to say. Sorry, Mark. You mentioned this idea of humanity. One of the problems, I think, is what Mark and I talk about, the dopamine hit, the feel-good factor. And one of the dangers of these data sets is they provide fake food. It's kind of like processed food rather than real valuable food for our brains. One of the things that you picked up, and I'd really like to just tease a little bit, you mentioned this idea of reading into the crime report beyond what it really says. That, for me, is a massive one. And I have blathered on about this for years to anybody that would listen. This idea of what's not in the crime report. I always remember, I'm lucky enough and old enough to remember Kim Rossmo when he was a DI, a working detective, coming up with his theories when he was coming around to doing his PhD. And I always loved the process that he came up with, which was coming up with these jeopardy surfaces. It's a map of data that's not crime data, but around criminality. So it was looking for other things. And if it was something really stupid, if there was a homicide or a series of robberies in an area, he wasn't looking for crime reports. He'd look for bus routes and taxi receipts and extraneous data sets that may allow him to form a pattern of well, what does this tell us about the victimology, or about where the boundaries are for where, like the Brandigans would talk about, these areas of the mental maps of the criminals. So they will look at where they want to go and commit crime, because if they're not aware there's an opportunity, they can't commit crime. Beyond Kim's approach, that led me in, or supported me going down an approach where I call it negative data. It's not negative, it's just zero. I.e., when you're doing volume crime, you have a hotspot. I hate hotspots. God, I hate them. But at that time, they were the trend. We can look, there's a hotspot of a crime in this area, so we throw resources at it. And yeah, okay, pardon my French, it's a no Sherlock moment. Useful, but it's not the secret sauce, as Mark would call it. And I would say, well, yeah, but hang on. Why is there a concentration of crime there versus somewhere else? If you look for the law enforcement, it's a problem because that's where the crime is. So that's where the problem's committing. So we have to focus on that. Well, hang on. If you're trying to solve the problem of crime to serve and protect the community, rather than just catch the criminals, yeah, okay, bring them to justice. What about the areas where there's not crime being committed? Why are the criminals choosing not to go there? And it might be because there's no houses there, or there's no access roads, or it might be because they don't have burglar alarms or guardians. But whatever the reason is, if you can identify the things that are driving zero crime in that area and import those into the areas that are having crime, maybe those solutions and that analytical understanding of what makes things tick might help you. And that works geopolitically as well. I know with Carmen, I remember watching one of her presentations that Mark pointed me to, where she got her analysts to come up with this kind of one of Kim's jeopardy surfaces of all the nations of the world in terms of their importance, in this case to the US, what kind of threat they imposed, but also how capable were they to carry out that threat. Kind of like Raiders of the Lost Ark. One of them, it starts off where Harrison Ford is flying over or running past a load of natives and they're throwing spears at him. They clearly hate the guy to bits, but are those spears likely to kill him up in a plane? No. So it was kind of capability versus capacity versus intent. And I love that. And where before I used to think, well, it's because we're not collecting the data. One of the things that worries me these days is if there were no crime reports, in this case, being simplistic, is it because there's no crime or just because the public have chosen not to report it for whatever reason? Lack of faith in law enforcement, too many barriers to reporting it, whatever the reasons are, you can speculate all day long. But is our data set false? Because if it is, any LLM or AI approach to that data set is going to go back to focusing on the hotspots of crime because that's the only data it can read. It can't read data that's not there.
I would just like to add, can I add this one thing also? The data, the LLM is only going to work in the data you put it in, and the data is not all going to be in the same database. So, Mark, what were you on?
No, it's a really important point. I just want to say it's not just whether people report the crime, it's whether the host agency accepts the crime report, right? I mean, literally in my own hometown, I once caught somebody trying to break into my shed and managed to chase them away. But when I called up my local PD, I got a phone call with a duty sergeant who was saying, "Oh, it's civil trespass." It's like, he was there with a crowbar. Dude, come on. He was trying to break in. But you can see that arbitrage of, is it a crime or not? But yeah, I think, just to go back, one final point on this particular bit, which is, I would say, so I think aggregate content is something we all have to deal with. There's information overload, we have to deal with it. And I think that we'll find a way through it. And then maybe through AI, but I think for me, the takeaway from a lot of this and from Debbie's work and this conversation is, I think the secret ingredient, I think going forward that will save us or doom us is our humanity, right? It's those inner values. And I think that's what we need to kind of, as we get more technical, this is going to it sounds terribly cheesy, but I can't think of a different way of putting it. But I think as we get more technical, we're going to have to get a little bit more spiritual and a bit more philosophical. I think we're going to have to remember that actually our biology presents opportunities as well as threats, right? I think sometimes the bias in our own discipline is, you're horrible. You're a water-based error machine that's just full of bias and you're going to get everything right. And that might be true, but also you're a kind of an innovation machine and an imagination machine and a creative machine. And I think that's something, and it's hard to quantify, it's hard to identify, it's certainly hard to train, but it's something I think we need to focus on.
And we're a caring machine.
Too true. So, Debbie, was there anything else you wanted to go over before we start to wrap things up? Is there anything you didn't have a chance to discuss or talk about today that you wanted to?
No, I just would like to say my new experiment, my new mad scientist genius craziness is my book, Elements of Crime Patterns by Routledge, which will have exercises like go into a coffee shop and look at the opportunities that people might present to steal things, like do actual real things in the real world are exercises in that book. And that's what I think we will have to do more, right? When as an analyst, I spent a lot of time just sitting there. I did things like go out in the field, but you're sitting there thinking life becomes very abstract. And I'm excited to listen to more of your podcasts. And I feel very honored to be here with people who are thinking about this because we care, right?
Can I raise something, Mark, just on that? I haven't read Debbie's new book. I've read the previous ones, all of them, including the unpublished policy or organisation-based one. I commend them to everybody. As journeymen and women in this profession, we've all shown, I hope, in this podcast that finding information to help you along your own journey at any point, whoever you are and whichever branch of profession you are anywhere in the world or whatever culture, getting the information to help educate and support you and make you think about what you do and therefore improve it is hard. So Debbie's books, there are hundreds of other books out there. The ones, in my view, that are the most useful are the ones written by practitioners or former practitioners, because they own the T-shirts. We've been there, we've done it. That's not to say any of them that are perfect. They are not. None of them are complete. If Mark and I write one, it would never be complete. They're just one more piece of information. Do though, avoid the books that are driven by organisations and policies. And I mean any organisation, not just our own. And I don't mean this in a bad way, but if they're driven by those organisations, there's always a political and a policy and an organisational bias inevitably going to be in them. You may have to deal with it in your day-to-day work as a professional, but your organisational bias is an additional bias to your own personal bias. So if you can just you'll have to take them in, but don't give them the same weight as those written by analysts for analysts, because those people hopefully are closer to the problem, the task and the truth than group products by policymakers or even professional bodies, because it's drawing group analyses. And one of the things that Debbie said earlier on, and I agree with this, we're all individuals, and it's that individual experience and drive that makes a difference, as far as I'm concerned, between an analyst and just another employee.
I would say the free book, one's free. So if you just want to read a free book, you could go to deborahosborne.com. It's my Out of Bounds book that I wrote for the Joint Military Intelligence College. So there you go with that.
Debbie, I mean, you thanked us. I really think we should be thanking you. We should be thanking you for your time today. We should be thanking you for your decades of public service and your continuing commitment to an incredibly difficult field. I hope you come back, but thank you for today. It's been really insightful, and thank you, Howard. And so we'll wrap up there. So thanks all for listening, and we hope to speak to you again soon.